Hi, I'm Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring, board-certified psychiatrist and expert in psychiatric side effects. Today we're going to talk about the history of antidepressants with sexual blunting. This may be a side effect you've heard of, but we're going to talk about some stuff that you may not have heard of, which is actually the role of these drugs in castrating people, essentially chemically castrating people or muting the sexual urges of people who have had sexual deviancy, essentially problems like that. I'm going to link it all into the issue of PSSD, persistent sexual dysfunction, and how this has really not been recognized in a major way by medical organizations. So that's what this video is all about. So right now, what I want to say is we actually are on the precipice of a broader acknowledge of PSSD really as a condition. And so for decades, obviously, as many of you watching this channel have known, this has been ignored by the medical community and written off as something that's in your head or, some kind of performance anxiety, and kind of blamed on people suffering. The people who bring this up, they say essentially they've got an anti-med bias and they've kind of ignored it. But as you know, lots of things have been changing recently. We had the European Union finally acknowledge it and added it to all of its labels in 2019. We've seen former heads of large psychiatric organizations tweet about this finally. We've seen PSSD reported in the New York Times. And so there's this snowballing recognition of this condition, this thing that was written off for a long time. The people who said they were having problems with it were made to feel like they're crazy. And honestly, it's kind of disgusted me that it's taken so long for people to recognize it, because essentially we've got 1 in 6 people taking this drug in the adults in the Western world, these antidepressants, and a lot of them think they're really safe. But the problem is it's impossible to predict who's going to have these enduring sexual problems. And so everyone really needs to know about this. And, there's also issues like we've got adolescent kids getting put on these before puberty who really haven't had a chance to really learn about their own sexuality. Now they're taking a drug that in uncommon instances may be actually leading to ongoing sexual dysfunction, and that can be really confusing for a young person. The perspective that I want to bring in this piece is that it really shouldn't have been this huge surprise that these drugs could cause persistent sexual dysfunction. We should not, as a profession, have been gaslighting these people and writing it off and kind of blaming them and their psyche for it. I want to back that up really with some of the points which I think are most salient as to why it is possible that these drugs really could have been causing sexual dysfunction. And so that's what we're going to go into today. So I want to start with just the history of sexual effects from these SSRI medications. So the first point I want to make is that since these drugs came onto the market, it was well known that they cause sexual dysfunction. This happened in the majority of people taking them. And when research began to design their studies to specifically ask people about sexual dysfunction on these SSRI antidepressants, they found that 50 to 80% of people were reporting some degree of sexual dysfunction immediately after starting the drug. And to put this in context, these drugs have barely been able to separate from placebo on their primary endpoint of depression in these clinical trials. And you could actually make a pretty good argument that perhaps the most potent and clear effect of the SSRI antidepressants is that these medications actually cause sexual muting rather than an antidepressant effect. And this was a point that I want to say was not lost on drug manufacturers, because drug companies actually sought to capitalize on this side effect. And actually, Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Prozac, ended up going on to develop a drug called duloxetine, Trilogy. And this is a short-acting SSRI, which is now marketed all over the world for erectile dysfunction. So yeah, they're using SSRIs now, and they're selling it as a treatment for erectile dysfunction. And although Trilogy is not marketed in the US, there's still multiple of these online pill mill pharmacy companies like Hims, where they sell drugs like Zoloft and Paxil as lifestyle medicines, essentially to assist people with premature ejaculation. So if that doesn't convince you that these drugs are potent at causing sexual problems, some of the next things I'm going to say is really going to convince you. So a lot of people may not know that SSRI antidepressants are actually used all over the world for the management of sex offenders and people with sexual deviancy by forensic psychiatrists. This is because they're looking for management strategies to prevent sexual offenses and sex offenders who have uncontrollable sexual urges And they need things that extend beyond incarceration, so they don't have to just lock them away forever, essentially. And so SSRIs were explored as potential treatments for this population. The hypothesis was by reducing sexual desire, the SSRIs might be a non-invasive way to manage them. And in fact, a number of small-scale studies and clinical trials were actually conducted throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, and they suggested that SSRIs might actually help some of these people gain better control over deviant sexual behaviors. So these studies showed that these meds reduce sexual fantasies, urges, and masturbation. But what you need to know is that this research was also limited by small sample sizes, and the studies also had short follow-up periods. But despite these studies, SSRIs are being used frequently off-label to manage sexual impulses in forensic settings these days, obviously in addition to psychological therapy as well. And although sex offenders are a group of people that population is going to feel the least likely to be sympathetic for, what is controversial in this space is actually that in some jurisdictions in the US, courts have ordered pharmacological treatment of sexual behavior as a part of sentencing or even being conditional upon them being released. And this obviously raises questions about the right to refuse such treatments. So now that we've reviewed the history of SSRIs in treating sexual symptoms, what I would like to say is that clearly they have potent sexual side effects, and I think the psychiatric profession has really done a bad job in acknowledging these, and they really shouldn't have been so hesitant in seeing them, because to me, it's not that much of a stretch. Like if you're using a drug that causes sexual problems and 50 to 80% of the people taking it, if you're marketing it as a treatment for erectile dysfunction around the world as a drug called Prilogy, and if you're kind of compelling people with sexual deviancy in some jurisdictions to take them to reduce their sexual urges, is it really that much of a stretch that there could be a proportion of people who, for reasons we don't understand, have some kind of toxicity to these medicines where they have enduring sexual dysfunction afterwards? To me, that is not a stretch. That just seems like totally plausible. So that's my perspective on, I guess, why psychiatry has been wrong to not recognize this for so long. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below.